Those black monstrosities, she spat, the words curling from her lips like something foul, are a blight on this community's aesthetic harmony, and you have precisely 72 hours to have them completely removed. I just stood there on my own freshly cut lawn, the scent of grass and the faint, clean smell of new silicone from the solar panel installation hanging in the warm afternoon air. Before me stood Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Crestwood Meadows Homeowners Association. She was a woman built like a filing cabinet, overflowing with paperwork and self-importance, her floral print dress straining at the seams as if trying to contain a supernova of pure entitlement. She held a clipboard like a scepter, tapping a perfectly manicured blood-red nail against a violation notice that had my name printed at the top in an aggressive, bold font. The sun, the very source of power she was protesting, glinted off her oversized sunglasses, hiding her eyes but not the triumphant sneer playing on her mouth. Behind her, her loyal crony, a thin, nervous man named Gerald, who served as the HOA's treasurer in her personal echo chamber, nodded vigorously, his head bobbing like a dashboard dog. I'd been in my new home for less than 6 months, a place I'd bought with 20 years of Air Force service packed into my savings account, a place meant to be a quiet harbor for my wife, Sarah, and me. The solar panels were my first big project, a declaration of independence and a smart financial move. They had been installed just yesterday, a sleek, black grid on the south-facing slope of my roof, silent, efficient, and to my eyes, beautiful. Karen cleared her throat, a sound like gravel being churned in a cement mixer. The fines, she continued, her voice dripping with sadistic glee, will commence at $500 per day. They are cumulative, of course, and if you refuse, we will place a lien on your property and proceed with foreclosure. We have an excellent attorney. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I felt a slow, cold burn start in my gut. The same feeling I'd get right before a critical mission, a dangerous calm that sharpened my senses. I had done my homework. I had read every line of the HOA covenants. I had researched state and federal laws regarding renewable energy. I was prepared, but I never expected the first salvo to be a full frontal assault on my own driveway. I simply looked at her, then up at my roof where the panel sat, quietly drinking in the sunlight, and then back at her. No, I said, the single word falling into the space between us with the weight of a granite block. Her sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. What did you say? She demanded. I said no, I repeated, my voice even, devoid of the anger simmering just below the surface. I will not be removing them. Her face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, the color clashing horribly with her dress. You will find, Mr. Turner, she hissed, that in Crestwood Meadows, my word is law. And with that, she shoved the violation notice into my chest, turned on her heel with military imprecision, and marched back to the golf cart she used to patrol her suburban fiefdom. That was the moment the war began. She just didn't know she was picking a fight with a man who had spent 2 decades planning for and winning unwinnable conflicts. This was just a different kind of battlefield. If you know what it's like to deal with a power-tripping HOA president or have your own neighborhood nightmare story, drop it in the comments below. I want to hear them. And do me a favor, hit that subscribe button because you're going to want to see how this ends. Now let me take you back to how this all started, because my battle with Karen wasn't just about solar panels. It was about a fundamental fight for the simple right to be left alone in my own home. After retiring as a lieutenant colonel, all I wanted was quiet. 20 years of moving, of deployments, of living out of government-issued everything had left me with a deep-seated craving for permanence. Sarah and I searched for a year before we found the house in Crestwood Meadows. It wasn't perfect, but it had a big yard, a solid foundation, and a roofline that was practically begging for solar panels. The neighborhood seemed idyllic, with manicured lawns and kids riding bikes in the street. The HOA, I was told, was mostly for maintaining the community pool and ensuring nobody painted their house neon pink. I read the covenants and bylaws cover to cover before we even made an offer. It was a dense, 200-page document of pure legalese, but my time in logistics had trained me to find the devil in the details. I saw the standard rules about lawn height, trash can placement, and fence types. I also found Article 9, Section 4, Architectural Modifications. It required approval for any exterior changes. But crucially, it was followed by Section 5, statutory compliance, which stated that all covenants were subject to and superseded by state and local laws. That was my ace in the hole. I knew my state had a right to solar law, a piece of legislation specifically designed to prevent HOAs from banning solar energy systems. The law was clear. They could impose reasonable restrictions on placement, but could not prohibit them or make the cost or efficiency of the system significantly worse. Before I even called a solar company, I did my due diligence. I drafted a formal application to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, or ARC. My proposal included the schematics from the solar company, a detailed plan showing the panels would be on the rear-facing roof slope, completely invisible from the street. They would be flush-mounted with black-on-black panels and a black frame to minimize visual impact. I even included a copy of the state statute, highlighting the relevant passages. I was building a paper trail, a fortress of documentation. This wasn't a request. It was a notification disguised as a courtesy. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the official HOA mailing address. The covenant stated the ARC had 30 days to respond, or the application was automatically approved. 30 days came and went. Silence. On day 31, I received my signed return receipt in the mail, proof that someone at the HOA office, a P.O. box managed by a third-party company, had received my package. Legally, I was golden. The installation was scheduled and completed in 2 days. The crew was professional, the system was activated, and for the first time, I watched my electric meter spin backward. It was a moment of profound satisfaction, a feeling of self-reliance and smart investment. The very next day, Karen appeared on my lawn. Her little ambush proved one thing. The ARC, which I later learned was just her and Gerald, had likely never even seen my application. Or more probably, she'd seen it, tossed it aside, and assumed I wouldn't dare proceed without her personal blessing. Her entire power structure was built on intimidation and the assumption that homeowners were too busy or too scared to read the rules themselves. When she'd stormed off in her golf cart, leaving me with the violation slip, I walked back inside, my mind already shifting into strategic planning mode. Sarah was at the kitchen window, her expression a mixture of anxiety and anger. "What was that all about?" she asked, her hands twisting a dish towel. "That," I said, holding up the paper, "was a declaration of war." I laid the violation notice on the granite countertop next to the original HOA covenants, my certified mail receipt, and a printout of the state solar access law. "She's fining us $500 a day." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Marcus, can she do that? We can't afford that." "She can write it on a piece of paper," I said, my voice calm and steady. "But she can't collect it. Not legally. She's banking on us panicking and giving in. We're not going to panic." I tapped the pile of documents. "This is our ammunition. Now we need a battle plan." The first step was a formal, written response. No emotion, just facts. It would be a polite but firm letter outlining the timeline of my application, the HOA's failure to respond within the legally mandated window, and the supremacy of state law. It would be a warning shot, a clear signal that I knew my rights and was prepared to defend them. I would give her one chance, and one chance only, to stand down. If she didn't, I would escalate. I wasn't just fighting for my solar panels anymore. I was fighting against the petty tyranny that turns a quiet neighborhood into a place of fear and resentment. I had spent my career defending my country from threats foreign and domestic. I wasn't about to let a suburban dictator bully me out of my own home. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, and her ignorance was about to become very, very expensive. My first letter to the HOA board was a masterpiece of restrained professionalism. I spent an entire evening drafting it, ensuring every word was precise and every claim was backed by evidence. It was addressed not just to Karen as president, but to the entire board of directors by name. Karen, Gerald the treasurer, and a woman named Brenda who served as secretary. I wanted to make sure they couldn't later claim ignorance or that Karen was acting alone. The letter began by politely acknowledging receipt of violation notice number 734. From there, I methodically laid out the timeline. On date X, I submitted a full application package for the installation of a solar energy system to the Architectural Review Committee via certified mail tracking number Y. I included a copy of the signed receipt proving delivery on date Z. I then quoted the section of the HOA bylaws that stipulated a 30-day window for the ARC to approve or deny an application, after which it is deemed automatically approved. I pointed out that 38 days had elapsed between their receipt of my application and the date of their violation notice. Therefore, per their own governing documents, my project was already approved. Then came the second punch. I quoted Article 9, Section 5, about all covenants being subject to state law. I then cited, by statute number, the state's Solar Access Act, and I quoted the key passage. A homeowners association may not prohibit the installation of a solar energy system by a homeowner. I explained that while they could impose reasonable restrictions, my system was already designed to be as unobtrusive as possible, being located on the rear roof slope and invisible from the street, thus meeting any conceivable, reasonable standard. I concluded the letter by respectfully requesting that they immediately rescind violation notice number 734 and cease any further accrual of fines. I stated that if the fines were not rescinded in writing within 10 business days, I would consider it an act of harassment and would be forced to seek legal remedy, for which I would also seek reimbursement of all associated costs. I made 2 copies. One was for my files, the other along with copies of all my evidence. The application, the mail receipt, the state law, was placed in a large manila envelope. The next morning I drove to the post office and sent it, once again, via certified mail with return receipt requested. It was an extra $7 that I considered a vital investment in my legal armor. Sarah was still on edge. "Do you think she'll actually read it?" she asked as I filed my copy away in a new accordion folder I'd labeled HOA War. "Oh, she'll read it," I replied. "The question is whether she's smart enough to understand it. People like Karen don't operate on logic. They operate on power. This letter challenges her power. She'll see it as an act of rebellion, not a legal argument." I was right. Exactly 8 days later, a new envelope appeared in our mailbox. It was a standard business envelope with the Crestwood Meadows HOA logo. Inside wasn't a letter of rescission. It was an official-looking invoice. It listed 15 days of fines at $500 per day for a grand total of $7,500. Stapled to it was a short, curt letter signed by Karen. It read in its entirety, "Dear Mr. Turner, the board has received and reviewed your letter. Your position is without merit. The aesthetic integrity of our community is paramount. The fines stand and continue to accrue. Payment is due within 30 days to avoid further action." They hadn't even bothered to address a single point I had made. It was a complete stonewall. This was the escalation I had anticipated. She was calling my bluff. That evening, the harassment moved from paper to person. I was watering the new sod in my front yard when Karen's golf cart came creeping down the street. This time she was alone. She pulled up to the curb, the electric motor whining softly, and just watched me. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, sunglasses on, arms crossed, radiating disapproval. It was a classic intimidation tactic, meant to make me feel scrutinized, to unnerve me. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I continued watering my lawn, moving the sprinkler methodically, as if she wasn't even there. After 5 long minutes of this silent standoff, she finally drove away. But the message was clear. I was a marked man. The next day, another letter arrived. This one was from the HOA's attorney. It was a much more formal and threatening version of Karen's letter, filled with legal jargon about covenant enforcement, property liens, and the board's fiduciary duty to uphold community standards. It demanded immediate removal of the panels and payment of the accrued fines, which were now listed as $8,000. They were trying to bury me in paper, to scare me with the specter of a lawsuit I couldn't afford. They underestimated my resolve. They also underestimated my financial planning. 20 years in the service teaches you to have a contingency fund. I walked back inside, placed the lawyer's letter in my file, and turned to Sarah. "Okay," I said, my voice calm. "Phase 2. It's time to find a lawyer of our own." Sarah nodded, her anxiety now hardened into determination. Do it, she said, whatever it takes. This was no longer about money or aesthetics. Karen and her board had rejected a reasonable, lawful path. They had chosen aggression. They had declared that the rules only applied to people they didn't like, and that their personal taste superseded state law. In my world, that's called tyranny, and I was about to teach them a very expensive lesson about the difference between power and authority. The battle lines were drawn, and they had just handed me all the justification I needed to go on the offensive. The next week was a blur of phone calls and online searches. I didn't want just any property lawyer. I wanted a fighter, someone who understood that this wasn't a simple contract dispute. This was a matter of principle. I looked for lawyers who specialized in HOA litigation, specifically those who represented homeowners, not the associations themselves. After vetting half a dozen firms, I found a name that stood out, David Chen of Chen and Associates. His website bio was brief but potent. He was a former Army JAG officer who had left the service to fight for the little guy against overreaching corporations and bureaucracies. His firm's motto was simple, Precis ut presidium, a Latin phrase meaning stand for the guarded. It resonated with me. I called his office and was surprised when he answered the phone himself. I gave him the 30-second version of the story. Retired vet, new home, solar panels, HOA on a power trip. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, there was a short pause. Mr. Turner, he said, his voice sharp and clear, they're trying to bully you into submission. It's a classic HOA playbook. When can you come in? 2 days later, I was sitting in his modest but immaculate office. David Chen was a man who radiated quiet competence. He was lean, sharp-featured, and wore a perfectly tailored suit like a uniform. He had my HOA war folder open on his desk, my meticulously organized documents spread out before him. He'd already reviewed the copies I'd sent ahead of our meeting. Your paper trail is perfect, Marcus, he said, using my first name as if we were already on the same team. Certified mail, clear timelines, citing their own bylaws against them. This is the kind of preparation that wins cases before they even get to court. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The state's Solar Access Act is our hammer. It's unambiguous. Their case is legally non-existent. The problem is, they have the HOA's war chest to fund their lawyer, and they're counting on you not having the resources or the will to fight back. They'll try to drag this out, bury us in motions, and bleed you dry. I have a contingency fund, I said. I'm prepared for that. David smiled, a quick knowing grin. Good, but I have a better idea. We're not going to play defense. We're going on the attack. He tapped a copy of the violation notice from Karen. This isn't just about your panels. This woman, this Karen, she feels untouchable. People like her never commit just one act of overreach. This is a pattern. I'm willing to bet you're not the only homeowner she's targeted. We need to find the others. This was the shift from a personal dispute to a community battle. David's strategy was brilliant. We wouldn't just sue to get them to back off my panels. We would build a larger case against the board for a pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and breach of fiduciary duty. A single homeowner fighting the board can look like a troublemaker. A group of homeowners united against a tyrannical board looks like a revolution. How do we find them? I asked. You start walking, David said. You take a notepad. You walk the neighborhood in the evening when people are home from work. You look for the telltale signs. A lawn that's a little too long, a basketball hoop that's been put away, a small garden gnome hiding behind a bush. Then you knock on the door and you introduce yourself. You tell them what the HOA is doing to you, and you ask a simple question, have you ever had a problem with the board? That weekend, I became the neighborhood surveyor. Sarah, now fully invested, came with me. We started with the houses on my own block. It didn't take long. 3 doors down lived the Millers, a young couple with 2 kids. I noticed their portable basketball hoop was folded up and crammed into their garage. I knocked. Mr. Miller answered, looking wary. I introduced myself and explained the situation with my solar panels and the $500 a day fines. His eyes widened in recognition. Karen, he sighed, shaking his head. She sent us a violation notice saying the hoop was a temporary structure not permitted to be visible from the street. She fined us $100 a day until we put it in the garage. My kids were heartbroken. He went inside and came back with a folder of his own. It was thinner than mine, but it contained the same angry red ink violation notices. We had found our first ally. 2 houses further down, we met Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 70s. Her crime? A small decorative fence around her rose garden, no more than 18 inches high. Karen had deemed it an unapproved structural modification and forced her to tear it out, fining her $1,000 when she didn't do it fast enough. Mrs. Gable cried as she told us the story. Her husband had built that little fence for her before he passed away. We spent 2 hours with her, listening, taking notes. By the end of the weekend, we had a list of 7 other families, each with a story of petty tyranny. There was a family fined for having the wrong shade of white on their trim, a man cited for parking his work van, a clean, unmarked Ford Transit, in his own driveway for more than 4 hours, and a couple forced to remove a small treehouse they had built for their grandkids. The common thread in every story was Karen. She was the sole arbiter of taste, the enforcer, the judge, and the jury. The fines were arbitrary, the enforcement was selective, and the emotional toll was enormous. People were afraid of her. They had all paid the fines and complied, feeling isolated and powerless. I took my notebook, now filled with names, dates, and violations, back to David Chen's office. He looked over my findings, a grim expression on his face. "This is exactly what I expected," he said, "but it's worse than I thought. She's not just a bully, she's running the HOA like a personal piggy bank, funded by illegal fines and intimidation. She's breached her fiduciary duty to the community in at least a dozen different ways." He stood up and walked to his window, looking out over the city. "We have them, Marcus. Now we don't just file a counterclaim. We file a class action lawsuit on behalf of every homeowner she has illegally fined, harassed, or extorted. We're not just going to get your fines dropped. We are going to get every penny she stole from these people back, with interest. And we are going to have her and her entire board removed from power." The fines against me had now topped $15,000 on paper, but that number was meaningless now. It was a phantom, an illusion of power that was about to be obliterated. The war had a new objective, not just victory, but liberation for the entire community. With David Chen leading the legal charge, our quiet resistance transformed into a full-blown intelligence operation. Our first move was to formally establish our group. David drafted a simple agreement for the 8 families, including Sarah and me, to sign, authorizing his firm to represent us collectively in a suit against the Crestwood Meadows HOA Board of Directors. It felt momentous, like signing a Declaration of Independence. Our little alliance now had a name: the Crestwood Homeowners for Fair Governance. Our mission was twofold: prepare the lawsuit and expose Karen's regime to the entire neighborhood. David's strategy was to starve them of their greatest weapon, secrecy. "Boards like this thrive in the dark," he explained during our first group meeting, held in my living room. "They count on homeowners being too disconnected and uninformed to challenge them. We're going to turn on the floodlights." He tasked us with a new round of canvassing, but this time, it wasn't just to find more victims. It was to gather support and proxies for the upcoming annual HOA meeting. "The annual meeting is her stage," David said. "It's where she gets to stand up in front of everyone and pretend she's a benevolent leader." This year, we're hijacking the proceedings. The plan was to use the meeting to formally present a petition to recall the entire board. Under the bylaws, a recall required a vote of a majority of the total membership. Getting people to show up to a boring HOA meeting was hard enough. Getting a majority to vote was nearly impossible. But the bylaws had a loophole: proxy voting. Any homeowner could sign over their vote to another member. Our goal was to collect enough proxies to control the outcome of the meeting before it even started. So we walked again. This time we were armed with information packets. Each packet contained a 1-page summary of our legal position regarding my solar panels, a list of the other documented abuses of power, without naming the victims to protect their privacy, and a simple, legally vetted proxy form. We went door to door, not as victims, but as organizers. The response was a revelation. Once people realized they weren't alone, the fear started to melt away, replaced by a slow-burning anger. We heard more stories. A family fined because their trash cans were put out at 5 a.m. instead of after 6 a.m. A man forced to power wash his driveway because of a single small oil spot. It turned out almost a third of the 150 homes in the neighborhood had been dinged for some petty infraction over the past 2 years, ever since Karen had been elected president. While we gathered our army of proxies, David was waging the war on the legal front. He filed our lawsuit. It was a formidable 60-page document that landed like a bombshell on the HOA's lawyer. It listed 9 plaintiffs and detailed a systematic pattern of racketeering-like activity, including illegal fines, selective enforcement, harassment, and breach of fiduciary duty. It demanded not only the rescission of all fines and a permanent injunction against the board's interference with my solar panels, but also the repayment of every fine levied against our group, punitive damages for the emotional distress, and all legal fees. Crucially, as part of the lawsuit, David filed a motion for discovery. This was the key that would unlock Karen's kingdom. The discovery request demanded that the HOA turn over 5 years' worth of financial records, including all bank statements, budgets, and expense reports, all meeting minutes, both for the board and the ARC, and all correspondence, including emails, related to violation notices. This was not a request they could ignore, like they had my first letter. This was a court-ordered demand. Their lawyer, a slick downtown type, who clearly underestimated David, tried to stonewall. He filed a motion to quash our discovery request, calling it overly broad and burdensome. David's response was swift and brutal. He filed a counter motion for sanctions, arguing that their refusal to produce the documents was a clear attempt to hide malfeasance. The judge agreed with David. He not only denied their motion, but ordered the HOA to produce all requested documents within 14 days or face contempt of court charges against the board members personally. It was a huge victory. The board was now legally compelled to hand over the very evidence that would incriminate them. 2 weeks later, 6 large bankers' boxes were delivered to David's office. It was a mountain of paper, a deliberate attempt to bury us in unorganized records. For the next week, David, his paralegal, and I were holed up in his conference room, fueled by coffee and a burning desire for justice. We were archaeologists, digging through the layers of Karen's regime. At first, it was just a mess of receipts and invoices, but then we started to find the patterns. We cross-referenced the fines they had collected with their expense reports. We found that thousands of dollars in fine revenue were being funneled into a discretionary budget controlled exclusively by Karen. The Community Events Fund, for example, had paid for a $2,000 planning luncheon at a high-end steakhouse for just her and Gerald. The landscaping beautification budget had paid for the installation of an elaborate new sprinkler system and exotic flower beds at Karen's personal residence. She was using the HOA's money collected from the very people she was terrorizing, to fund her own lifestyle. But the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that would bring it all crashing down, was in the meeting minutes. We found the minutes for the ARC meeting that was supposed to have considered my solar panel application. The minutes, signed by Karen and Gerald, stated that my application was reviewed and denied for failing to meet community aesthetic standards. The date of the meeting was 3 days after I had submitted my application. They had lied. They hadn't ignored my application. They had secretly denied it and never bothered to inform me, a direct violation of the bylaws which required a written denial to be sent to the homeowner. They had created a fraudulent document to cover their tracks, never imagining that a court would one day force them to produce it. David held the document up to the light. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "This is perjury. This is fraud." We now had irrefutable proof that Karen and Gerald had not only broken the HOA's own rules, but had also falsified official records to do so. The lawsuit was no longer just a civil matter. It had crossed the line into potential criminal conduct. The annual meeting was in 1 week. We had the proxies, we had the evidence, and we had the will. Karen was about to walk into her own public execution, and she had no idea we were the ones who had built the gallows. The week leading up to the annual HOA meeting felt like the final tense hours before a major operation. Our team, the Crestwood Homeowners for Fair Governance, had secured proxy votes from 68 of the 150 households. Combined with our own 9 votes, we controlled 77 votes, a slim but absolute majority. We had the numbers to recall the board. David Chen and I spent 2 days preparing our presentation. We didn't want it to be a dry, legalistic argument. It needed to be a story, a cinematic reveal of corruption that would be undeniable to everyone in the room. We created a PowerPoint presentation, a weaponized slideshow of Karen's own documents. The first slide showed my house, the solar panels gleaming, followed by the violation notice with its $500 a day threat. Then we showed the state's solar access law in big, bold letters. The next section was the pattern of abuse. We included anonymized photos. The ghost of Mrs. Gable's little garden fence, the empty spot in the Miller's driveway where the basketball hoop should have been. Next to each photo was a copy of the outrageous violation notice Karen had issued. We were building a narrative of shared suffering. The final section was titled Breach of Trust Following the Money. This was the kill shot. We had scanned the key documents from the discovery boxes. There was the receipt for the $2,000 steakhouse lunch, paid for by the Community Events Fund. There was the invoice for Karen's personal landscaping, paid for by the beautification budget. And then, the grand finale, a side-by-side comparison. On one side was a copy of my certified mail receipt showing the date the HOA received my solar panel application. On the other was the falsified ARC meeting minutes, dated just 3 days later, where they claimed to have denied it. Below it, in giant red font, we put the text from the bylaw requiring them to notify me of any denial in writing. This is our story, David said, clicking through the final slide. Simple, visual, and devastating. We let the documents speak for themselves. The night of the meeting, the community center clubhouse was buzzing with an unusual energy. Typically, these meetings were attended by a dozen or so retirees and the board members. Tonight, the room was packed. Over 100 people were there. Our canvassing had worked. People weren't just curious. They were invested. Karen, Gerald, and Brenda sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking slightly bewildered by the massive turnout. Karen, dressed in a power red pantsuit, beamed, clearly assuming the crowd was there to celebrate her leadership. She banged a small gavel on the table to call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see such a fantastic turnout for our annual meeting, she began, her voice oozing false warmth. She launched into her prepared speech, a self-congratulatory monologue about her accomplishments. The new petunias at the front gate, the freshly painted pool deck, the successful enforcement of our community standards that protect our property values. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel the tension in the room, a low hum of anticipation. After 20 minutes of her droning on, she finally moved to the next item on the agenda. New business. This was our opening. Before she could move on, I stood up. Madam President, I said, my voice projecting across the room. Every head turned towards me. Karen's smile tightened. Mr. Turner, this is not the forum for personal grievances. This isn't a personal grievance, I replied calmly. This is a point of order regarding the governance of this association. According to Article 3, Section 2 of the bylaws, a member may make a motion for the recall of the board of directors at any time during an official meeting. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen's face went from pink to a deep, blotchy red. That's preposterous. On what grounds? On the grounds of gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, harassment of members, and misappropriation of funds, David Chen said, standing up beside me. He introduced himself as legal counsel for a significant portion of the homeowners present. He held a thick binder. And we have brought evidence. Karen sputtered. This is out of order. I will not allow this ambush. It's not an ambush, Karen, said Mr. Miller, the father whose basketball hoop had been targeted. He stood up from his seat in the third row. It's a reckoning. Then Mrs. Gable stood up, her small frame trembling, but her voice firm. You made me tear down the fence my husband built. One by one, our allies began to stand. It was a wave of defiance washing over the room. The power was shifting, visibly, in real time. Karen, seeing her authority crumbling, banged the gavel repeatedly. Order! I demand order! But it was too late. David Chen walked to the front of the room and plugged his laptop into the projector. "If the board has nothing to hide," he said coolly, "then you will have no objection to the members seeing the facts." The first slide appeared on the large screen behind the board's table, a picture of my solar panels. Karen's reign was about to be dismantled, document by document, in front of the very people she had terrorized. The show was about to begin. The moment the first slide of our presentation hit the screen, a hush fell over the room. The image was a crisp, high-definition shot of my roof, the solar panels looking sleek and modern against the sky. Karen, Gerald, and Brenda, seated at the table directly beneath the screen, were forced to twist around to look. Their faces were a study in confusion and dawning horror. David Chen acted as the narrator, his voice calm and authoritative, like a prosecutor laying out an open and shut case. "This is the home of Mr. Marcus Turner," he began, "and these are his solar panels. According to the Crestwood Meadows HOA board, these panels are a blight on the community." He clicked to the next slide, which displayed violation notice number 734 in its entirety, the $500 per day fine circled in red. Murmurs spread through the audience. "However," David continued, clicking again, "according to our state legislature." The text of the Solar Access Act filled the screen. David read the key passage aloud, his voice resonating with legal authority. "An association may not prohibit the installation of a solar energy system." The murmuring grew louder. You could feel the tide of opinion turning. People were looking at Karen not with fear, but with suspicion. Next came the pattern of abuse section. An image of the Millers' empty driveway appeared. "This is where a basketball hoop used to be," David said. "A place for two children to play. The board fined the family $100 a day until it was removed." Mr. Miller, still standing, simply nodded. The next slide showed the bare patch of dirt where Mrs. Gable's rose garden fence had been. "This fence," David said, his voice softening slightly, "was built by a member's late husband. The board ordered it torn down and fined a 74-year-old widow $1,000. Mrs. Gable was now openly weeping, and her neighbors were comforting her. The anger in the room was palpable. We showed 5 more examples, each one a testament to Karen's petty cruelty. With each slide, Karen's composure disintegrated. "This is a distortion," she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "We were upholding the rules everyone agreed to." "Did the rules require you to falsify official records?" David asked, his voice cutting through her tirade. He clicked to the final damning section. The screen showed the side-by-side comparison. My certified mail receipt proving my application was delivered on May 10th, and the fraudulent ARC minutes, signed by Karen and Gerald, claiming they had denied it at a meeting on May 13th. "The bylaws state," David announced, his voice booming, "that the homeowner must be notified of a denial in writing. Mr. Turner was never notified because this meeting, ladies and gentlemen, never happened. This document is a fabrication created to justify an illegal campaign of harassment." The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting at the board. "Thief!" someone yelled. "Liar!" screamed another. Gerald, the treasurer, looked like he was about to be physically ill. He had shrunk in his chair, his face pale and clammy. Brenda, the secretary, just stared at the screen, her mouth agape. She looked genuinely shocked, as if she had no idea this was going on. Karen, however, doubled down. "These are lies, forged documents," she yelled, her voice hoarse with rage. "This man," she pointed a trembling finger at me, "is a troublemaker trying to destroy our beautiful community." "The only thing being destroyed here, Karen, is your credibility," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I held up a thick, bound stack of papers. "And speaking of destroying things, let's talk about where our money has been going." David clicked to the next slide. It was the receipt for the $2,000 steakhouse lunch for 2. "Paid for by the Community Events Fund," David announced. Next, the invoice for over $4,000 for exotic plantings and irrigation system upgrade at Karen's home address, paid for by the beautification budget. This was the final nail in the coffin. The evidence was undeniable, displayed in glorious high definition for all to see. They had been caught, red-handed, stealing from their neighbors. Karen seemed to finally realize she was cornered. Her rage collapsed into a sort of sputtering panic. It was a business lunch. The landscaping was a test pilot for a community-wide program. The excuses were so flimsy, so pathetic, that people actually started to laugh. It was a dark, bitter laughter of people who had been vindicated. I moved for an immediate vote of no confidence and the recall of the entire board of directors, I said loudly, formally making the motion. Seconded, yelled at least 20 people at once. According to the bylaws, the vote had to be taken immediately. We had our proxy forms organized in a binder. We handed them to a neutral party, a retired accountant who had volunteered to tally the votes. As he began the count, Karen, Gerald, and Brenda sat in stunned silence, pariahs at their own party. Brenda, the secretary, finally broke. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and faced the audience. I had no idea, she stammered, tears in her eyes. I just signed what Karen told me to sign. I never saw these expenses. I resigned from the board, effective immediately. One down. Gerald just sat there, sweating, unable to make eye contact with anyone. Karen stared straight ahead, her face a mask of furious denial. The accountant finished his count. He cleared his throat and addressed the room. The results of the motion to recall the board are as follows, he announced. In favor of the recall, 112 votes. Against the recall, 3 votes. The 3 votes were, presumably, Karen, Gerald, and one of their few remaining cronies. The motion passes. The board is hereby recalled. A wave of applause and cheers washed through the room. It was a sound of liberation. In the midst of the celebration, Karen finally snapped. She grabbed the gavel, slammed it on the table with all her might, cracking the cheap wood. "You will all regret this," she screamed, her voice a raw shriek of fury. "This community will fall apart without me. I hope your property values plummet to 0. She stormed out of the room, shoving people out of her way. Gerald scurried out behind her like a kicked dog. The reign of terror was officially over. The war was won, the tyrant deposed. But the battle for justice and for compensation was just getting started. The public humiliation at the annual meeting was the decisive battle, but the war wasn't over. Karen's spectacular downfall was a moral victory, but David Chen was adamant that we press our legal advantage to its conclusion. A public shaming is satisfying, he told our group the next day, but a court judgment is permanent. We need to make them pay, literally, to ensure this never happens again. With the old board dissolved, an interim board was appointed from a pool of volunteers, including Mr. Miller, and, to my surprise, me. I was reluctant, but the community insisted. My first act as an interim board member was to pass a motion granting our lawyer, David Chen, full access to all HOA records and instructing the HOA's own legal counsel to cooperate fully with our lawsuit. We were now, in essence, suing ourselves, and we were determined to win. The HOA's insurance company, which held the policy for directors' and officers' liability, quickly realized the old board's position was indefensible. Their lawyers, who were far more pragmatic than the one Karen had hired, reached out to David to open settlement negotiations. They wanted to stop the bleeding. Their initial offer was insulting. They offered to have the HOA pay our legal fees and drop all the fines against me and the other plaintiffs. That was it. No punitive damages, no repayment of the previously extorted fines. David laughed when he told me about it. "They're testing us," he said. "They think we'll be happy with a simple win and go away." David's counteroffer was a declaration of total war. He laid out our demands, which had now been refined based on the mountain of evidence we had. First, a permanent injunction, recorded in the county land records, explicitly forbidding the HOA from ever interfering with my solar panels or any future solar installations that complied with state law. This would protect not just me, but every future homeowner in Crestwood Meadows. Second, full repayment of every fine that Karen's board had levied against the 9 plaintiffs in our group. This totaled just over $28,000. Third, punitive damages for the harassment, emotional distress, and the fraudulent actions of the previous board. David argued that the board's conduct was not merely negligent, but malicious and intentional, which opened the door for significant punitive awards. He set the initial demand at $250,000. Finally, full payment of all our legal fees, which were now substantial. The insurance company's lawyer balked, particularly at the punitive damages. That's an outrageous figure, he argued. This is a simple HOA dispute, not a major personal injury case. David's response was cold and calculated. He sent them a single email containing one attachment, a copy of the falsified ARC meeting minutes. His email read, "Our position is that this document constitutes felony-level fraud. We are more than happy to present it, along with the evidence of financial malfeasance, to the County District Attorney's Office. We are certain they would be very interested in hearing about a local organization committing mail fraud and embezzlement. Or you can make this right for the homeowners who were victimized. Your choice." It was a masterful move. The threat of criminal charges against their insured clients, Karen and Gerald, was the ultimate leverage. A civil lawsuit was one thing. A criminal investigation was something else entirely. It would be a public relations nightmare. And if convicted, Karen and Gerald could face jail time. The insurance company would be on the hook for their legal defense in that case too, a prospect they clearly wanted to avoid. The lawyer called back within the hour. His tone was much more conciliatory. The negotiations got serious. Over the next 2 weeks, David engaged in a grueling series of back-and-forth offers with their legal team. They tried to whittle down the numbers, but David held firm on the core principles. He argued persuasively that the punitive damages weren't just to punish Karen. They were to compensate for the climate of fear she created. How do you put a price on Mrs. Gable's heartbreak or the Miller kids losing their place to play? How do you quantify the stress and anxiety of receiving daily threatening letters? We finally reached a number. The settlement agreement was a thing of beauty. The insurance company, on behalf of the HOA, agreed to pay a total of $340,000. The breakdown was precise. First, $28,450 to repay all the illegally collected fines to the plaintiffs. Mrs. Gable would get her $1,000 back. The Millers would get their money back. Second, $111,550 to cover our legal fees and expenses, ensuring we paid nothing out of pocket. The remaining $200,000 was for punitive and compensatory damages, to be divided among the 9 plaintiff families, based on the severity of the harassment they had endured. My share, for having been the primary target and bearing the brunt of the initial assault, was the largest. But every one of the families received a substantial sum. It was more than just money. It was a formal acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to them. The agreement also included the permanent injunction protecting solar rights, and most satisfyingly, a clause that permanently banned Karen and Gerald from ever serving on any HOA board in our state again. They had to sign it as a condition of the settlement. On a quiet Tuesday morning, the 9 families of the Crestwood homeowners for fair governance gathered once more in David Chen's conference room. We each signed the settlement papers. When it was done, there wasn't a wild celebration. It was a moment of quiet, profound relief. We had faced down a bully and won. We had restored not just our own rights, but the integrity of our community. David handed each of us our checks. Looking at the 5-figure sum in my hand, I didn't feel like I'd won the lottery. I felt like I had earned my peace. The money would go right back into our contingency fund, a reminder that being prepared is the best defense. The war was over. Justice had been served, and it had come with a very specific price tag. In the weeks following the settlement, a strange quiet descended upon Crestwood Meadows. It wasn't the tense, fearful quiet that had existed under Karen's rule, but a peaceful, relaxed silence. The neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The most immediate and visible change was the moving truck that appeared in front of Karen's house. There was no for sale sign, no open house. The property was sold in a private, off-market deal, likely to avoid the indignity of having to face her former subjects. I watched from my window as movers loaded her gaudy furniture and boxes of belongings. She directed the movers with the same imperious air she had used to patrol the neighborhood. But the power was gone. She was just a bitter woman leaving in disgrace. I never saw her face clearly, and I never spoke to her again. There was nothing left to say. Gerald, her erstwhile treasurer, had already sold his house and vanished a week earlier, equally silent in his departure. The neighborhood was cleansed. The interim board, with me as a reluctant but committed member, set about the task of rebuilding. Our first order of business was to overhaul the HOA's governing documents. We hired a specialized paralegal to help us rewrite the covenants, stripping out the vague, subjective language that had allowed Karen to weaponize aesthetics. We replaced phrases like aesthetic harmony with clear, objective standards. Rules were now based on safety and necessity, not personal taste. We introduced new articles ensuring transparency, requiring all board votes and financial expenditures over $500 to be published in a monthly digital newsletter. We simplified the architectural review process and explicitly codified the supremacy of state laws like the Solar Access Act. We were building a constitution, not a rule book for a petty dictatorship. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. The next official HOA meeting, held to ratify the new covenants and elect a permanent board, was once again packed. But this time, the atmosphere was collaborative and hopeful. The new covenants passed with a 98% approval vote. A new board was elected, comprised of reasonable, community-minded people, including Mr. Miller, who was now the proud owner of a permanently installed, regulation-compliant basketball hoop. I respectfully declined a permanent board position, stating that my service was complete. My job had been to dismantle a broken system, not to run the new one. I was a soldier, not a politician, and my war was over. One sunny Saturday afternoon, a few months later, I was on my roof inspecting the solar panels, wiping away a thin layer of dust. They were working perfectly, silently converting sunlight into energy, saving us hundreds of dollars a month. Looking out over the neighborhood, I saw other changes. The Miller's kids were playing basketball in the driveway. A young couple 2 streets over was having a new, tasteful wooden play set built in their backyard. And on the roof of a house down the block, a crew was installing a brand new set of solar panels. The homeowner, a man I'd met at the recall meeting, had called me for advice a few weeks prior. I had walked him through the new simplified application process. His application was approved by the new ARC in less than a week. Sarah came out onto the back patio, holding a glass of iced tea. "What are you smiling at up there?" she called up to me. "Just admiring the view," I said, looking from my panels to the new set being installed across the way. It was more than just a view of rooftops. It was a view of a community that had taken its power back. Later that day, Mrs. Gable stopped by. She was holding a small potted rose bush. "This is for you," she said, her eyes bright. "It's from my garden, a thank you." "You didn't have to do that, Mrs. Gable," I said, touched. "Yes, I did," she insisted. "You gave us all our neighborhood back." She looked past me into my garage where my HOA war accordion file sat on a shelf. "You know," she said quietly, "after my husband passed, I felt so alone. When she came after me for that little fence, I felt so powerless. I thought that's just how things were. You showed us that one person, a few people, standing up for what's right can change everything." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. The money from the lawsuit was a powerful symbol of our victory, a tangible consequence for Karen's abuse. The $340,000 figure was a headline, a shocking number that represented the scale of her downfall. But the real victory wasn't the check. It was this moment. It was the sound of children playing, the sight of neighbors talking over their fences without fear, the quiet satisfaction of a community at peace. It was the knowledge that the sun shining down on my roof was now a protected right, not a privilege granted by a tyrant. We had fought for our home, and in the process, we had helped our neighbors reclaim theirs. And that was a victory more valuable than any amount of money. The restoration of Crestwood Meadows was a gradual, organic process. The fear that had permeated the neighborhood for years didn't vanish overnight, but it was replaced by a cautious optimism, which soon blossomed into genuine community spirit. The new HOA board, led by the ever-sensible Mr. Miller, made it their mission to be the anti-Karen board. Their motto, half-jokingly, became, "What would Karen not do?" Instead of sending out violation notices, they sent out friendly reminders in the monthly newsletter. Instead of levying fines, they offered help. When an elderly resident's lawn grew too long, a couple of board members showed up with their own mowers and took care of it, no questions asked. The HOA's funds, no longer being siphoned off for steak dinners and personal landscaping projects, were put to actual use for the community. The pool got new lounge chairs, the small park got a new set of swings, and they hosted a neighborhood-wide barbecue to celebrate the ratification of the new covenants. It was the first such event in years, and hundreds of people showed up. I saw families who had been pitted against each other by Karen's selective enforcement now sharing a picnic blanket. The atmosphere was light, joyful, and free. David Chen became something of a local legend. His success in our case led to other homeowners in different HOAs seeking his help. He successfully litigated 2 more major cases against tyrannical boards in neighboring towns that year, using the same playbook. Find a pattern of abuse, build a coalition, and use the legal system to expose and dismantle the corruption. He sent me a Christmas card that year with a simple, handwritten note inside. Marcus, thanks for the inspiration. Keep fighting the good fight. My life settled into the quiet routine I had craved. The solar panels became a normal, unnoticed part of my house. The legal battle, once an all-consuming fire, was now a story I would tell, a collection of documents in a file box. But its effects were permanent. The settlement money had provided a significant financial cushion, allowing Sarah to retire a few years earlier than we had planned. We used a portion of it to do some traveling, something we'd always dreamed of, but never had the time or security to do. But the most significant dividend was the peace of mind. It was the freedom of living in my own home without the constant threat of a clipboard-wielding despot appearing on my lawn. One afternoon, I was working in my garage when a young man I didn't recognize knocked on the open door. He looked nervous. He was in his late 20s and was holding a thick packet of papers. "Mr. Turner?" he asked. "My name is Ben. My wife and I are thinking of buying the house for sale down the street. The realtor gave us the HOA documents. I was reading them and, well, I saw your name on the injunction about the solar panels. I Googled it and I found a news article about the lawsuit." I nodded, waiting. "I just wanted to ask," he said, "what's it really like living here? Is the HOA a nightmare?" I smiled. It was the question I would have wanted to ask before I bought my house. I invited him in and spent the next hour walking him through the entire story, the rise and fall of Karen, the community alliance, the legal battle, and the reforms that followed. I showed him the old weaponized covenants and the new reasonable ones. I told him about the new board and the community barbecue. 2 years ago, I told him, I would have told you to run and never look back. But today, this is a good place to live. We had to fight for it, but it's a real community now. We look out for each other. Ben looked immensely relieved. "Thank you," he said, shaking my hand. "That's all I needed to hear." He and his wife bought the house. They were exactly the kind of neighbors we now had in abundance. Decent, friendly people who just wanted a peaceful place to raise their family. The ultimate proof of our victory came in a roundabout way. Mrs. Gable, who had become a dear friend to Sarah and me, had a nephew who was a real estate agent. He called her one day excited. "Aunt Carol," he said, "you won't believe this. I was at a regional real estate conference, and one of the speakers was a property law expert talking about HOA trends. He used Crestwood Meadows as a case study. He explained that the story of our lawsuit and subsequent reforms had become a model for other communities. The legal precedent set by our settlement, particularly the recorded injunction protecting solar rights and the successful recall based on documented malfeasance, was being taught in seminars for real estate professionals and property managers as an example of successful homeowner activism. Our little neighborhood war had sent ripples out into the wider world. The story wasn't just about my $340,000. It was about a transferable model for justice. It was a roadmap for other people living under the thumb of their own Karens. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my lawn. I was sitting on my back patio, the electric bill from the month before on the table. It read, "Total amount due minus $42.18. A credit. The panels were producing more than we used." I looked up at my roof, where the panels lay dark and silent against the twilight sky, having done their work for the day. They were no longer a symbol of defiance. They were a symbol of peace, of self-sufficiency, of a battle hard fought and decisively won. The victory wasn't just in the check I'd received or the quiet hum of my inverter. It was in the restored community, the legal precedents we'd set, and the simple, profound fact that I was home and I was free. The epilogue to our story unfolded not in a courtroom or at a contentious meeting, but quietly in the everyday life of the neighborhood we had reclaimed. The new HOA board, with Mr. Miller at the helm, continued to foster a culture of cooperation over confrontation. They established a welcome wagon committee, which was really just a group of friendly neighbors who would greet new residents with a basket of baked goods and a simple one-page summary of the most important community rules, like trash day and pool hours, along with contact numbers for the board members, encouraging them to call with any questions. It was a world away from Karen's approach of waiting for an infraction and then levying a punitive fine. The community's finances, once a black box of slush funds, were now a model of transparency. The monthly newsletter included a detailed budget breakdown, showing every dollar spent, from landscaping contracts to the cost of chlorine for the pool. As a result, trust in the board soared, and homeowner engagement, paradoxically, became less necessary. People felt confident that the board was acting in their best interest, so they didn't feel the need to police the board's every move. The peace was real and lasting. My life, too, found its new normal. The HOA war file was eventually moved from the garage shelf to a box in the attic, a relic of a past conflict. My days were filled with gardening, woodworking, and spending time with Sarah. The drama was over, and I was grateful for the quiet. However, the legacy of our fight occasionally resurfaced in unexpected ways. About a year after the settlement, I received an email from a man in a different state. He had read a blog post that detailed our story, anonymously, of course, and tracked me down through a veterans network. He was in the middle of a similar fight. His HOA was trying to force him to remove a wheelchair ramp he had installed for his disabled son, claiming it was an unaesthetic modification. He was feeling isolated and overwhelmed. We spoke on the phone for over an hour. I walked him through our entire strategy: the meticulous documentation, the search for allies, the power of a unified front, and the importance of finding a lawyer who was a bulldog. I emailed him copies of our proxy forms and the structure of our presentation. I wasn't giving legal advice, but I was sharing a battle plan. 6 months later, he emailed me again. "We won," he wrote. "We recalled the board, and they're rewriting the covenants to be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Your story gave us the roadmap and the hope we needed. Thank you." It was then that I fully understood the scope of what we had done. The victory wasn't just for Crestwood Meadows. The principles were universal. It was about standing up to arbitrary power, about the strength of a community united for a just cause, and about the fact that the law, when wielded correctly, can be a shield for the powerless. The final, most ironic chapter in the Karen saga came from Mrs. Gable. Her nephew, the real estate agent, had a client who was looking at properties in a less affluent community about an hour away. While showing a home, he ran into the HOA president there, a woman who was complaining loudly about the quality of the lawn care. It was Karen. She had landed in a new, smaller pond. Her power diminished, but her personality unchanged. According to the nephew, she was already universally despised in her new domain. She hadn't learned a thing. Some people never do. Her fate was to be a petty tyrant in a series of ever-shrinking kingdoms, forever fighting battles she was destined to lose because she could never understand that true authority comes from respect, not fear. On the second anniversary of the recall meeting, our little group of plaintiffs, the Crestwood Nine, got together for a potluck dinner at my house. We sat on the back patio under the warm glow of string lights powered by the sun, and we talked and laughed. Mr. Miller raised a glass. "To Marcus," he said, "the man who brought a tank to a knife fight." We all laughed. "It wasn't a tank," I corrected him. "It was a binder, and a good lawyer." We toasted to David Chen, to our community, and to each other. As the evening wound down and our friends began to head home, Mrs. Gable hugged me goodbye. "You know," she whispered, "I planted that rose bush you gave me right where that horrid little fence used to be. It's thriving." That, I thought, was the perfect metaphor for it all. Where something ugly and divisive had been torn down, something beautiful had been given the space to grow. My solar panels continued to spin the meter backward, a silent, steady testament to our victory. The $340,000 was a number that defined the cost of Karen's hubris. But the true value of our fight was immeasurable. It was in the laughter of our neighbors, the freedom to live without fear in our own homes, and the quiet, enduring peace that settled over Crestwood Meadows, a community that had gone to war and emerged stronger, fairer, and more united than ever before.